This is LSAT PrepTest 145, Section 1, Passage 1. It's about the Federal Theater Project's Negro Units, a government-funded African-American theater company consortium from the 1930s. It's a low-difficulty passage, and the structure is pretty straightforward, but there's a twist buried in paragraph 2 that catches people who read on autopilot. Now, this is a humanities passage. The author is making an argument, not just telling a story. The main point is that these Negro units were a breakthrough in African American theater because their internal disagreements actually produced something valuable, a genuinely diverse body of work. Now, paragraph 2 is the most important paragraph in this passage. I will come back to it. But first, paragraph 1, that's just background. The FTP was big, with 10,000 workers, 185 production units in 28 states, 500,000 people watching every week. Now, you don't need to memorize these numbers, they exist for one reason. The author wants you to feel the scale of this before narrowing the lens. And the lens does narrow pretty quickly. By the middle of the paragraph, you're focused entirely on the Negro units. You want to move through the stats here quickly. What you've got to hold on to is the claim at the very end. The author says these units came closer than any previous group to founding a truly national black theater. That is the thesis of the whole passage. And there's one word right before it you should notice, the word arguably. The author believes this claim, but they're hedging just enough to stay credible. That is a confident but measured tone. If you see an attitude question, that is your anchor. Then paragraph 2 is where students mess up. The paragraph opens by connecting the Negro units to the Harlem Renaissance. And that detail is important. The author is saying there was already a rich tradition of thinking about art and race before the FTP showed up. So when these units started arguing about what kind of plays to produce, that argument had real depth behind it. It was not chaos. It was people with different ideas who actually cared. Then the author lays out the debates. Folk drama versus urban realism versus adapting white playwrights' work. Blending into mainstream culture versus standing apart from it. Instructing versus entertaining. And there is a lot of tension packed in here. And your instinct on a fast read is to think the author is flagging a problem. All this fighting, all this disagreement, it sounds like dysfunction, but that would be wrong. Look at the last few sentences of that paragraph. All those debates produced a wide range of productions reflecting diverse views and so on. So the author just turned every one of those disagreements into something good. The conflict was the source of the diversity. So if you've read these debates as a flaw, you've misread the entire passage. Then, the swing Mikado shows up as the proof. The author is not picking a random production, they pick one that flipped the minstrel tradition. African-American performers doing an ironic take on a white classic. Now, that word inverted is carrying weight. The example is there to show the units weren't just putting on plays, they were using theater to challenge racial assumptions. And the author adds that the play pushed audiences to think about what it means to assume black roles both on and beyond the stage. That phrase stretches the point past theater into real life. The author chose this example because it proves the range and the ambition of what these units were doing. Now, paragraph 3 is short and the passage cuts off, but the piece you have zooms back out. The FTP kept theater alive during the Depression, and that's context, not argument. It tells you the Negro units did not exist in a vacuum. They had government support at a time when the arts were struggling. You want to read this quickly because it's reinforcing what you already know. Now, the key move here is the turn at the end of paragraph 2. Internal conflict becomes creative diversity. Now, every hard question in this passage will circle back to whether you understood that relationship. Now, the author's stance here is positive. They see their Negro unit as a genuine achievement. The main trap is treating the debates in paragraph 2 as criticism. The passage is built so that you wade through all that and then land on a payoff. Students who skim the end of paragraph 2 are going to walk into main point and attitude questions thinking the author was troubled by those fights, but the author was not. The author loved what came out of them. Now, before you hit the questions, make sure you know these 3 things. First, why does the author bring up the Harlem Renaissance? What work is it doing for the argument? Second, what is the relationship between the debates and the diversity of productions? And third, why is the swing Mikado the example the author chose instead of something simpler and safer. So that was passage 1. On to passage 2. I'll start with passage 2 in just a minute. All right, we're good to go. This is LSAT PrepTest 145, Section 1, Passage 2. This is a law passage about punishing corporate crime, medium difficulty passage, and it reads pretty straightforward, and that's the problem because it feels like you understood it. But the argument shifts underneath your feet, and most students don't notice where. Now, the passage takes an idea that sounds totally logical and grinds it down. The economists say corporate penalties should be based on cost-benefit math. The author says that math breaks the second it touches reality. Now, paragraph 1 is the economist's pitch. You want to read this at a normal speed, but read it with suspicion. They lay out a pretty clean formula. The penalty should exceed the profit the company made from the crime. And you get a nice example here. Corporation makes $6 million selling something dangerous. So fine at $7 million. Done, justice served. Sounds smart, sounds fair, and the author wants you to feel the pull of that logic. But this paragraph is just bait. The author gives the economist the mic first, so the takedown lands harder. If you finish paragraph 1 nodding along, you are exactly where they want you. Set up to confuse the economist's view with the author's view. Now, paragraph 2 is where the passage actually lives. You want to slow way down here. The first line calls the economist's approach highly impractical, if not impossible to follow. And that phrase is doing everything. The author is saying this whole framework might not even work. And then you get the reason, detection ratios. That is the passage's term for how often corporate crimes actually get caught. The economist's formula quietly assumes every crime gets detected, but that's a fantasy. So courts have to estimate how often crimes go undetected. And once you do that, the math explodes. If a company has only a 1 in 10 chance of getting caught, a $7 million fine is not going to scare them. You would need to fine them at least $60 million to make crime stop paying. Now, the author is walking you through the numbers here slowly and deliberately. You don't need to memorize them, just feel what they're doing. They're showing you that the economist's clean little formula turns absurd the moment you add one real-world variable. And that escalation is the focus of the entire passage. One missing input, detection rates, and the entire model collapses. Then paragraph 3 finishes the job. You want to speed up here. The heavy lifting is done. The author drops in a real number. Recent studies put detection rates at around 10%. So this is no longer a hypothetical. And at 10%, the penalties you would need under the economist model would bankrupt companies and throw thousands out of work. So the cost-benefit approach taken seriously destroys the thing it's trying to regulate. Then, right at the end, the author offers the fix. The passage calls it the assignment of moral weight to particular crimes. In plain English, some crimes are worse than others because of what they are, not just what they cost. Poisoning people's food is different from fudging a report. So the penalty system needs to account for that. You want to watch that last sentence closely. The author says penalties should be practical as well as just. Both. That tells you the author is not throwing out cost-benefit entirely. The author is saying it's not enough by itself. Now, the key move here is the detection ratio problem in paragraph 2. The economists build a house on one assumption, that every crime gets caught. The author pulls that assumption out, and the whole thing falls apart. Every hard question traces back to this. Now, here is the main trap. A lot of students will read this passage and think the author completely rejects cost-benefit analysis, but that is going too far. The author thinks it is incomplete, not wrong. The fix is not to abandon the formula, it's to add moral weight alongside it. And so if you see a choice that says the author dismisses the economist's reasoning, that is bait. The real answer will say something like the approach needs to be supplemented or expanded. And that distinction will show up on main point and author's attitude questions. Now, before you get to the questions, you want to check yourself on 3 things. First, why does the author let the economists make such a clean case in paragraph 1 if the whole point is to undermine it? Second, what single real-world factor breaks the cost-benefit formula? And third, what does the author want added to the system, and why does that last sentence matter? So that was passage 2. On to passage 3. This is LSAT PrepTest 145, Section 1, Passage 3. It is a comparative or dual passage set. The topic is women's history versus gender as an analytical category. Medium difficulty passage, but the trap here is subtle. These passages look like they're on the same team, but not quite. The most important moment across both passages is paragraph 3 of passage A. That's where the author finally stops being fair and tells you what they actually think. Everything before it is just setup. So passage A, paragraph 1, this is setting the scene. Two things happened in the 1990s. Historians brought women's history into the mainstream. Then they swapped the subject from women to gender. Now read that word receded. Women as individuals faded out, and something more abstract took over. The author is already tipping their hand with that word choice. Abstract things replacing real people. That is not neutral language, but most students blow right past it. Now, paragraph 2 is the tricky one. It starts by giving gender its due. The author uses the phrase explanatory potential, which sounds like praise, and it is praise. But then comes the pivot. The author says that women as a topic gets dismissed as too narrow. Read closely here. The author is reporting that dismissal, not agreeing with it. The author frames women's history as celebratory and gender as analytical. And that framing looks balanced on the surface, but there is a quiet resentment underneath. The author is watching something they care about get shoved aside. Now, paragraph 3 is only 3 sentences long, but it's the whole ballgame. The phrase "and yet," those two words flip everything. The author suspects that gender obscures as much as it reveals. That is the thesis of this passage. Not that gender is useless, but that it costs too much. It buries the particular. It loses individual women and how they actually lived. You want to slow way down here. If you skim paragraph 3, you will misread the author's stance. Now, passage B is a totally different kind of writing with no methodological debate, no self-reflection. This is a historian doing the work, showing you how gender functioned in ancient Augustan Rome. You want to move through it faster than passage A because the content matters, but the structure is straightforward. The first paragraph gives you Augustus's play. Rome is a mess after the civil wars. His fix is moral legislation, marriage laws, penalties for adultery, rewards for having legitimate kids. He places women inside the family and says the state's health depends on them staying there. Then the second paragraph draws out the consequence. By tying national stability to women's domestic behavior, Augustus made gender roles more visible and more political. So look at the word constrained paired with the word politicized. Women got less freedom, but more significance. Then Augustus grabs the title Father of the Fatherland. And so the family metaphor is not just rhetoric anymore, it is his official identity. Then the last paragraph pushes it one step further. Artists pick up the same language. Domestic imagery becomes imperial imagery. Women in art are not portraits of real people. They are symbols of the regime. It's old-fashioned style, making the present look like the past. And that's propaganda, even if the author doesn't use that word. Now here is the key move. Passage B is a perfect specimen of what passage A describes. Gender analysis, social systems, structures underneath relationships, and not a single individual woman in sight. No names, no voices, no stories of how any Roman women actually responded to these laws. Now, passage B does exactly what passage A's author fears. It makes gender visible while making women invisible. That is the relationship here. It is not simple agreement or disagreement. Passage A's author would look at passage B and say two things. First, yes, this proves gender analysis works. Augustus really did build a political system on top of gender roles. Second, this is exactly the problem. Where did the women go? So the main trap is treating these passages like they're allies. They do overlap in subject matter. They do both care about gender, but passage A is skeptical about the method that passage B uses without a second thought. Students who miss that will pick answers that say both authors share the same approach, but they don't. One is questioning the lens, the other is looking through it. Now for the author's stances. Passage A's author is not anti-gender. The author grants that gender has analytical power. The concern is about what gets sacrificed. Passage B's author has no visible anxiety about methodology at all. That author is just doing the analysis without pausing to ask what's being left out. Now, before you go on to the questions, check yourself on three things. First, can you name what passage A's author thinks was specifically lost in the shift to gender? Second, can you explain how passage B serves as both a success story and as a cautionary tale for passage A's argument? And third, do you know why Augustus's title matters to passage B's point about gender and political power? So that was passage 3. We're going to go on to passage 4 now. This is LSAT PrepTest 145, Section 1, Passage 4. This is a science passage about a biologist trying to resurrect Lamarckism using the immune system. This is a medium difficulty passage because the author sounds neutral while they are quietly taking a side. If you don't catch the tone, you're going to miss some questions. Now, the passage is doing one thing here. It is presenting a bold hypothesis and then slowly undercutting it. The main point is that Steele's attempt to revive Lamarckism is creative but unproven. Now, the most important paragraph here is paragraph 3. That is where the author shows their hand, so I will spend the most time there, but we'll get there. First, paragraph 1. This paragraph is doing two jobs. First, it tells you Lamarck's idea. Organisms change during their lives and pass those changes on to their kids. Second, it tells you that idea is dead. The giraffe example is not just background, it's there to remind you how ridiculous mainstream biology considers this. Then Steele walks in claiming he's got evidence, and so right away you feel the tension. One guy versus the entire field. That framing matters. You want to read this at a normal speed, but lock in the power imbalance. Steele is the underdog here, and the author wants you to see that. Then paragraph 2 is pure setup. It explains how immune cells work. Your body has genes that mutate fast. Those mutations create different defenses. When one works, the system keeps it. None of this is controversial. Nobody argues about it. The passage gives you this, so Steele's argument in paragraph 3 has something to stand on. Skim it, grab the basics, don't memorize the biology. Just understand that immune cells change their own DNA. That is the raw material Steele needs for his theory. Now, paragraph 3, you want to slow way down here. This is where everything happens. Steele says the changed RNA in immune cells gets copied back into DNA. And that part is actually real. It's been seen in other contexts. But then Steele takes a massive leap. He says that new DNA could travel to the reproductive cells, swap in, and get inherited. That is the Lamarckian part. And right at that moment, watch the author's word choice. The author calls Steele's story elegant, but speculative. Elegant means it sounds good. Speculative means there is no proof. So that two-word phrase is the author's entire verdict on the hypothesis. Now, most students blow right past it because the explanation sounds so reasonable. That is the trap. The quality of the explanation is not the same as the strength of the evidence. Steele built a nice-sounding story. The author noticed it's a story. Then, paragraph 4 asks the obvious next question. Does this actually happen? Steele says yes, and points to a pattern of mutations as proof. But the author puts Steele's key phrases in quotation marks. Signature, written all over, strongly suggests. Those quotes are doing serious work. The author is stepping back from Steele's language, holding it up for you to look at rather than standing behind it. Then the passage closes with other biologists offering simpler explanations. The last viewpoint you hear is not Steele's, it is the skeptics. And that's a choice the author made. They're telling you exactly where they land. Now, the key move here is the contrast between the surface and the subtext. On the surface, the passage gives Steele a thorough, respectful explanation. Underneath, every critical moment has a qualifier or a distracting move, like speculative. The skeptic's getting the final word. The test writers are going to build their hardest questions around that gap. The author thinks Steele's idea is worth explaining but not worth believing yet. They're not hostile, they're not dismissive, they're just unconvinced. The big trap here is confusing a fair presentation with an endorsement. The author explains Steele's theory in detail, and students read that effort as support, but it's not. Explaining somebody's idea doesn't mean that you agree with it. And that mistake is going to cost you on main point and author's attitude questions. Now, before you get to the questions, you want to check yourself on three things. First, why does the passage start by reminding you that Lamarckism is considered a joke? Second, what does the word elegant but speculative actually tell you about the author's position? And third, why do the skeptics get the last word instead of Steele? So that was test 145. We're going to move on now to test 144. This is LSAT Prep Test 144, Section 1, Passage 1. This is the Schoenberg passage. It's a defense of a composer most people find unlistenable. Pretty low difficulty passage. The author's opinion is pretty straightforward, and so is the structure. But there's a trick at the top that will cost you points if you don't catch what they're doing. Now, this is a humanities passage. The author is arguing that Schoenberg's music deserves respect, not for its technical innovations, but for what it expresses emotionally. And that distinction is the entire passage. Now, before we go paragraph by paragraph, I want you to know this, that paragraph 6 is the one that matters the most. That is where the author finally says what they actually think. Everything before it is just build up. If you read the earlier paragraphs as being the main point, you're going to pick the wrong main point answer. Now, the passage opens up with a nasty quote. Somebody is ripping apart a piece of music. It sounds like a modern critic going after Schoenberg. That is what you're supposed to think. Then the author pulls the rug out. That quote is from 1806 and is about Beethoven's Fidelio. So that twist is doing a lot of work here. Before the author even makes an argument, the critics have already been undermined. The message here is that people said the exact same thing about Beethoven and they were dead wrong. So why should we trust the same complaint about Schoenberg? You've got to understand that this opening is the entire foundation of the argument. Paragraph 2 keeps the Beethoven comparison going. Both composers pushed boundaries, both got attacked for it. And there is one detail here you've got to grab. Beethoven's toughest work didn't catch on until after the phonograph was invented. The author is saying here that difficult music needs repeated listening. That is aimed directly at Schoenberg. The author never spells that out. You've got to connect it yourself. And the questions will check whether you did. Then paragraph 3 shifts to Schoenberg's early music. You want to read this one carefully because the author is doing something subtle. They pick Schoenberg's most accessible piece and say Brahms fans would love it. Then they slide in on that dig, saying people enjoy it once they get past the fact that Schoenberg wrote it. The author is saying the resistance is not about the sound. It's about the name on the label. That is evidence for the argument. The author is showing you that hatred of Schoenberg is a prejudice, not a real musical judgment. Now, paragraphs 4 and 5, you can move through those quickly. They trace Schoenberg's evolution. He pushed his harmonies past tonality. Then he invented the 12-tone system to create order in that new space. The author mentions Schoenberg saw himself as a man of destiny. That is, of course, a big personality detail, but don't let it distract you. These paragraphs are just filling in the timeline. There's no argument here. Now, there is one thing you want to notice at the end of paragraph 5. The author says the music got more condensed, more violent in its contrasts, then explains why listeners struggle. But the author states it as a fact, not as a problem. There's no sympathy for the confused listener. File that away. Then paragraph 6, you want to slow way down here. This is the whole passage in concentrated form. The author says the real question about music isn't how it's made, it's what it has to say. And that single sentence is the thesis. Everything about technique and style and 12-tone systems, that's all secondary. Then comes the claim that makes the passage interesting. Schoenberg captured emotional states that music had never recorded before. And the very last sentence loops back to the opening quote. The critics call the music incoherent and shrill. The author says no. It's disturbing because it tells the truth. Same words, totally opposite meaning. The passage is a closed circle. Now, the key move here is that bait and switch at the top combined with the rebuttal at the bottom. The opening quote sets up critics as wrong by connecting them to those who trashed Beethoven. The closing sentence takes their exact language and redefines it. The disturbance is the point. Now, the author believes Schoenberg is essential and unfairly dismissed. Here is where students go wrong. The passage spends a lot of time on Schoenberg's 3 musical styles and the 12-tone technique. So it's tempting to think the passage is about his innovations, but it's not. The author flat out tells you that's not what matters. you can expect a main point answer choice that mentions the 12-tone system or Schoenberg's role in musical evolution. And that answer is going to feel right because you will remember reading about those things. But it's wrong. The right answer will focus on emotional expression and the unfairness of the criticism. Now, before you get to the questions, check yourself on three things. First, why does the author use a quote about Beethoven to open a passage about Schoenberg? Second, what does the author say is the real measure of any piece of music? And third, what is the Brahms comparison in paragraph 3 actually doing? Is it a fun fact or is it part of the case the author is building? So that was passage 1. Next, we're going to cover passage 2. This is LSAT PrepTest 144, section 1, passage 2. This is a law passage about biotech patents and whether they're hurting basic scientific research. Medium difficulty passage. The trap here is that the author's opinion hides behind 2 paragraphs of other people's fears. This is a takedown passage. The author picks a side. The main point is that fears about biotech patents blocking basic research are wrong. They are built on a misunderstanding of how patents actually work. Now, the most important paragraph is paragraph 3. Everything before it is set up. If you don't catch this switch here, you're going to walk into the questions thinking the passage is neutral, but it's not even close. Paragraph 1 is just scene setting. Biotech companies and academic researchers have started embracing intellectual property protection. Then the passage raises a question. Is all this patenting getting in the way of basic science? That question is the focus of the entire passage. Don't linger here, just register the question and keep on moving. Paragraph 2 is where it gets dangerous for you, because it is persuasive. You hear about restrictions on materials, genetic sequences, cell lines, altered animals. You hear about researchers scared they're going to get sued. You hear about fees that could shut down basic research. And it sounds alarming, but that's the trap. None of this is the author talking. This is the author reporting what worried scientists believe. The author is setting it up so paragraph 3 can shoot it down. So if you walk out of paragraph 2 nodding along, you've already set yourself up to miss the main point. Now you want to slow way down for paragraph 3. That's where the author steps out. And it starts with what looks like a small concession. Sure, the old tradition of freely sharing materials has moved toward more of a market model, but then the author hits you with this. Even before patents were involved, some researchers were already hoarding materials from competitors. So patents did not create the problem. And that undercuts the whole premise of paragraph 2. And then the author gets specific. Scientists who resist patenting are confusing 2 things. They think a patent gives someone a right to block access to biological materials, but it doesn't. A patent is about commercial rights. And that confusion is the backbone of the entire passage. You pull it out, the whole argument collapses. And then the author keeps going. They give you 2 concrete reasons why the fears are overblown. First, patent lawsuits cost a fortune. Companies use them against market competitors, not against some grad student doing basic science. And second, courts have traditionally carved out exceptions for non-commercial research. And so even if somebody tried to enforce a patent against a basic researcher, the legal system would push back. And then you've got the final turn. Patents don't just fail to hurt research, they actually help it. They give scientists economic incentives and control over licensing. So that is a full reversal from where paragraph 2 started. We went from patents are killing science to patents are fueling science. Now, the key move here is that confusion the author identifies between patent rights and the right to deny access to materials. The hardest questions will circle back to that. The test writers know that you absorbed all those fears in paragraph 2, and so they're counting on you to forget the author called those fears a misunderstanding. Now, the author's opinion is pro-patent, full stop. They are not cautiously optimistic. They are not weighing both sides. The author thinks the opposition is factually wrong. And that word matters, saying it's wrong, not just debatable. Students who read this passage as being balanced will grab choices about weighing concerns or acknowledging legitimate fears, and they will be wrong. Now, one more thing to watch. The structure here is set up and tear down. Paragraph 2 builds a case. Paragraph 3 dismantles it point by point. Every single fear from paragraph 2 gets a specific rebuttal in paragraph 3. And so if you see a question about the relationship between those 2 paragraphs, that is your answer. Now, before you hit the questions, make sure you've got these three things locked down. First, why does the author bring up the fact that early biotech researchers restricted access even without patents? Second, what exactly is the misunderstanding the author accuses the worried scientists of making? And third, why does the author think patent holders won't actually go after basic researchers? If you can answer those three questions, you're going to be good on this passage. I'll be back in about 2 hours, 2 Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, for my regular daily live Q&A on anything at all, LSAT and law school admissions. I'll see you all then. Talk soon.